Have you ever planted and tended beautiful summer and winter squash in your garden only to come out one day and find that the plant is wilted for no apparent reason? Maybe you water it and the wilting doesn't improve. You might be dealing with one of the sneakiest pests around, squash vine borers. I say sneaky because squash vine borers are really hard to spot in your garden. The adults are quite elusive. In my years of gardening, I've only seen an adult one time, but I've seen the effects of their presence plenty of times. That's because of the developmental cycle of this insect. All of its developmental cycle is done either in the ground or inside the plant, and so you don't know that you have this pest in your garden usually until you see the effects of its presence. Hi everyone, welcome back to So Arizona. I'm Kara, and today I'm going to be talking about what to look for when it comes to this pest and how they affect your plants, and also how to manage them organically. Here's what happens with a squash vine borer. The larva will develop in the soil over the winter until it pupates and emerges with the first warm temperatures of summer. And this is really applicable right now because in June and July, things are really starting to get hot. And so you will more than likely find that you have problems with squash vine borers around this time of year. With the first summer heat wave, the adult is going to emerge and it's going to mate, and then it's going to start looking for a place to lay its eggs. And that is your carefully tended squash vine. This is a really important part of the developmental cycle because now is the time you may be able to see signs that the squash vine borer is present in your garden. The adult moth will lay eggs at the base of your squash vine, and when those eggs hatch in just 1 week, those larvae will then dig into the base of your squash vine, and they will leave telltale signs that they're there by the holes that they leave as they dig into the squash vine. They're going to feed inside of that squash stem for 4 to 6 weeks before they move on to the next cycle. And as they do this, you may start to see frass, or a yellowish, brownish sawdust type material being pushed out of the holes in the base of that squash vine, and that is their poo. So when you're checking your garden in June and July during these hot months for the presence of this pest, trying to be vigilant and to protect your plants, look for the holes that those larvae leave as they enter the squash vine, and also the frass that they are pushing out as they feed over the next 4 to 6 weeks. As they feed, they are going to damage the tissue inside the squash vine, and they are going to disrupt the vasculature, or the flow of water from the roots into the top of the plant, and that's what causes the wilting that occurs. And you may find that your plant is wilting and think, oh, it's just been really hot, so I need to give this plant more water. But if there's the presence of the larva inside the stem, that plant is not going to react by perking up like it usually would when you give it a nice drink. Inside that stem, those fat little white larvae are just feeding away, getting ready for their next stage, which, like I said, will happen 4 to 6 weeks later, when they will emerge, drop to the soil, burrow in, and prepare to spend the rest of the fall and the winter developing so that they can emerge again the next season with the first high temperatures. So what can a gardener do to prevent and treat squash vine borers in the garden? Just like with many other pests that you want to manage organically, you can start with cultural controls. And just as a reminder, cultural controls are modifications that gardeners can make in the garden to make it a less hospitable environment for pests. The first thing you can do is to modify when you're planting your squash. Whether you're planting seeds or seedlings, you can either plant them early before the squash borer emerges from the soil, or you can plant them late after they've already emerged and flown away because they've found no hospitable plants in your garden. Either way, you may be able to miss the life cycle and the emergence of the squash vine borer if you do this. Southern Arizona gardeners are pretty lucky because we can wait to plant our squash until the second round of summer crops with the monsoon season, and by that time, hopefully, we will have missed the emergence of the squash vine borer. The second thing you can do is to try to plant varieties that the squash vine borer doesn't really like very much, and those are Cucurbita muscata varieties, things like the cheese pumpkins and butternut squash. Squash vine borers just don't really like these very much, so I really like planting these types of squash in my garden. I have spoken many times about one of my favorite squash, and that is the Magdalena Big Cheese. And since that's a cheese pumpkin, it is a muscata variety, and the squash vine borers so far have not bothered it. I've grown it for 3 years in my garden, and I've had no problems with with infections with that plant. The third thing that I have done several seasons is wrap the base of my squash vines with some sort of a material. I've heard that you can do it with aluminum foil or with plastic wrap. I have not tried those methods, but I've read that those work pretty well. I have had good luck with using pantyhose. So if you use a strip of pantyhose, that nylon material is actually really nice because it's very pliable. You can kind of tie it around it, and that material will stretch and grow, allowing that stem to increase in circumference as the plant gets bigger, but it'll also prevent that squash vine borer from entering into the base of the plant. You still want to check on the base of your plant just to make sure there have been no sneaky squash vine borers burrowing into the plant either on top of or below that material, because they are pretty smart. The next thing is to monitor your plants. Now, just because you have planted early or planted late or wrapped the stem does not mean that the squash vine borer can't outwit you. So definitely be looking for the telltale holes in the base of the stem, as well as the frass that could be emerging from those holes that will alert you to the presence of those larvae inside. You can also cover your plants when they're small with a floating row cover, so a mesh or a shade cloth or something that is going to block the entry of the squash vine borer from getting to the base of your plants. This cloth will have to be removed as the plants get bigger and mature and start to bloom, because you don't want to block the pollinators from getting in to pollinate your flowers, because the whole point is being able to have fruit, right? Another thing you can do is to rotate where you plant your squash. So if you planted them in one bed last season, you want to plant them in a completely different area the next season. And that's because as those squash vine borers emerge with the summer heat, you don't want them to find their favorite plant waiting for them just above them. And that's another important point when it comes to using floating row covers, because if you've planted in the same bed year over year and then you cover with row covers, then you're going to provide a very sheltered habitat for the squash vine borer to come and lay their eggs. Sticky traps are another great option if you think that there are squash vine borers in the area. So even if you can't catch the adults in the act because they're so sneaky, you may be able to catch them when you're not looking. These yellow sticky traps will attract males and females by their color, but primarily it will attract the males because it contains a pheromone. And so the males will come to the sticky traps thinking that they are detecting a female, only to get stuck on the sticky traps instead. You can also apply beneficial nematodes to the soil, and those beneficial nematodes will attack all sorts of pests in the soil, whether it's root knot nematodes, which I've talked about before, or the larvae that are developing under the soil of the squash vine borer. You can find beneficial nematodes for purchase at Arbico Organics if you're in Tucson. If you find the signs of a squash vine borer inside the stem of your plant by seeing the holes or the frass there, then you may be able to do something about it. You can get a sharp, clean tool, you can gently make a slit in the base of that stem, and you can extract those larvae that are feeding inside the stem. There is a chance that the plant can recover if you've detected the larva soon enough and the damage isn't too great. And that's by mounding the soil up over the area where you made the cut, and the squash may actually re-root there and heal and finish out the season for you anyway. I have not found sprays to be helpful at all, because most of those developmental cycles are happening either inside the plant or under the ground, and as I said before, it is very hard to spot a squash vine borer moth. There's one other practice that has proven so important for me in my garden, and that is having replacement plants. So the practice of succession planting comes up again here, and that is replanting seeds or transplants at specific intervals, whether it's 2 weeks or 4 weeks or whatever it happens to be for you in your garden. Succession planting proves to be such an important technique for preventing all kinds of different pests, as well as getting a maximum productivity out of your garden. And here with squash vine borers, it's no different. I like to plant seeds every 3 or 4 weeks so that I always have new transplants to put out into my garden. And that's because whether it is the heat and the dry conditions of summer that are really causing stress for my zucchini, then I have replacement plants to refresh them throughout the growing season. But I also have plants to refresh them in case they get attacked by pests that I was not on top of and didn't detect soon enough. So for zucchini and summer squash, we can plant those a couple of times a year during the summertime. And we can also replant if we get infections from squash vine borers or other pests. And that is also true for pumpkins and squash. So if you want to start seeds in your house to have available for monsoon season planting, then you can do that, and then you can put those out with the monsoon season. Now you know all about the squash vine borer, its life cycle development, how to look for its presence, and most importantly, how to prevent it in the first place. Please let me know in the comments if you've battled squash vine borers in your garden, and if you have any techniques that I haven't mentioned here, I'd love it if you would share them in the comments below for the benefit of me and the other viewers of the video. I'm Kara from Arizona. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, happy gardening.